The following program will examine, from a sociological standpoint, the history and the current state of affairs between traditional cisgender people and their non-normative gendered counterparts. In particular, we will be focusing on the transgender movement, individuals who don't feel at home in their biologically given body and dare to break free from the mold. This field is particularly relevant today, as the lives and stories of transgender individuals are just now coming to the forefront, as media, public opinion, and the scholarly world are finally beginning to take note of this present, yet far too under-acknowledged part of the human race. Beware! Much of the information to follow is not happy. The facts and figures we will present to you are tragic examples of the way society treats those who view it as the other. We will discuss issues like the absurdly high mortality rates of transgendered people of color, and everyday struggles of using the bathroom, and the constant fear of assault that transgender individuals have come to accept as normal.
%10,
15%,
20%.
Hey, I'm DJ, and I'm here with the stats. Researchers in 2011 have found that 40% of transgender adults have attempted suicide rates compared to 1.6% of the general population.
20%,
35%,
20%.
30% of transgender adults smoke compared to 20% of the U.S. population.
5%,
5%,
8%.
22% of transgender adults have been harassed by the police.
15%,
5%,
10%.
10%,
10%,
10%.
19% of transgender adults have reported being homeless, and 11% being evicted due to their gender identity.
5%,
5%,
5%.
15% of transgender adults are making under $10,000 compared to 4% of the U.S. population.
30%,
40%,
15%.
78% of transgender minors have been harassed in school.
Some of the research done into transgender affairs is narrative-based, by either looking into the stories, blog posts, or court cases of transgender individuals. Much of the research, the majority of the research actually, is done through surveys, however. Researchers send out broad surveys to much of the transgender community, asking them questions about their life and how they face discrimination. One of the primary examples of this is the National Transgender Discrimination Survey. For years, social scientists have looked at gender from a categorical model. There are two categories, man and woman. It's becoming increasingly clear, however, that gender is not categorical, it's continuous. There are many forms of non-normative gender presentation, most of which we never even experience in our everyday lives, or even think about. Because of this, however, there hasn't been much research done into these fields, so unfortunately, there aren't much sources that we can bring to you today.
The main theoretical perspective researchers use when studying this axis of inequality is called social constructionism. Social constructionism is a theory that knowledge and many aspects of the world around us are not real in and of themselves. They only exist because we give them reality through social agreement. An example of this would be crime. Certain acts are deemed criminal only because lawmakers have said so due to enough widespread agreement in Congress. Now, with regards to gender identity, the reality is that gender is a social construct, and it is finally time that we recognize that. The theoretical framework that goes contrary to social constructionism is called gender essentialism. Gender essentialism is the outdated and discredited approach that sees men and women as having unchangeable differences. It's the idea that men and women have different options and act differently in life due to factors that are inherently true about them. Gender essentialism is both reinforced by gender stereotypes and it strengthens them. Take toys, for example. Boys are taught that they ought to like cars and dragons, where girls are taught to like playing with dolls. These types of toys tell children, specifically boys and girls, how to be boys and how to be girls. It tells them that they need to like what is boyish and they need to like what's girly.
Discrimination and mistreatment have been experienced across innumerable categories, including employment, education, family life, health and access to care, housing, interactions with the criminal justice system and the military, with legal documentation, and notoriously with bathrooms, but the list goes on and on. In every level of education, starting in K-12 to the graduate level, trans people have experienced severe mistreatment. According to the U.S. Transgender Survey, 17% of trans students have dropped out of school due to severe peer and faculty abuse. In the workplace, it has been reported that 30% of trans people have either been fired, denied a promotion, not hired, or otherwise experienced mistreatment due to their gender identity. In the same survey, 77% of respondents claim to have taken otherwise unnecessary precautions to evade conflict and mistreatment, like hiding, delaying their transition, or quitting their job altogether. Discrimination in the workplace is perhaps the catalyst for the high rate of 20% of trans people claiming to have participated in the underground economy, like sex work, drug sales, or other criminalized means of employment. With regards to the house and the home, 1 in 8 trans people have reported to be kicked out of the house, and 1 in 10 have reported to be violently assaulted by an immediate family member due to their non-gender binary expression. Conversely, those who said that their immediate families were supportive were less likely to report a variety of negative experiences related to economic stability and health, such as experiencing homelessness, attempting suicide, or experiencing serious psychological distress. This is compounded by the discrimination faced in the housing market and the significantly higher chance of homelessness that transgender people face. With regards to documentation, around 2/3 of trans people said that none of their IDs listed their preferred name or gender, cost being a major barrier. Equally as disparaging, 2/3 of transgender people with IDs not presenting the expected name or gender have claimed to have been verbally harassed, refused service, told to leave, or physically assaulted. The consequence of such predominant stigma and discrimination have also led to a plethora of health and health-related issues. 1 in 4 gender nonconforming individuals from a survey of nearly 30,000 respondents claim to have major issues with the insurance because of their gender identity. Negative connotations with the healthcare system has led to 23% of respondents from an anonymous survey to have opted out of seeking necessary healthcare out of fear of mistreatment, and 33% because they could not afford it. What makes this especially detrimental is that these adverse impacts faced by transgender people are compounded by each additional component of discrimination they face. For example, the mistreatment of trans people starting in schools yields a higher dropout rate, which can inhibit access to jobs, which could lead to higher chances of living in poverty. These outcomes then affect their ability to access housing and healthcare, which as a result leaves them more susceptible to verbal harassment, sexual assault, and violence. The cycle can start anywhere but can continue cyclically. The intersection between one's gender expression and other characteristics of themselves also augment disparities in mistreatment. Trans people of color, undocumented trans people, and trans people with disabilities are more likely to face severe economic hardship and violence than their counterparts. Despite all this, the hope is that the current data and accounts of the discrimination non-binary individuals face will help change the views of both the public and policymakers on transgender people's lives and the adversities they confront every day.
There's been a lot of activism in the realm of gender identity and gender presentation. For example, we can look at clashes at Cooper's Donuts, which was in May of 1959. And during this clash, there was a group of drag queens and hustlers who fought LAPD officers who were in downtown LA raiding the Cooper's Donuts place, which is a popular meeting place for gay people, trans people, and drag queens. And during this clash, the patriot ended up throwing coffee, utensils, and donuts at the officers because they were invading their social space. If we fast forward to August of 1966, we can see the Compton's Cafeteria Riot, which occurred in Tenderloin District of San Francisco. And this was one of the first recorded LGBTQ-related riots in U.S. history, and it marked the beginning of transgender activism. The Stonewall riots in 1969, they're considered to have sparked the LGBTQ movement. During this incident, police raided Stonewall Inn, which is a gay club in NYC, and the crowd, who was wary of raids, decided to riot. And there were several days of demonstrations that LGBTQ members participated in, including transgender people, during this time. So we can see a wave of legislation pertinent to LGBTQ rights that started becoming enacted in the 1970s. In 1975, for example, Minneapolis became the first city to pass a law that prohibited discrimination against transgender people. Looking at 1993, we can see that Minnesota became the first state to extend protections against discrimination for transgender people. When we fast forward to 2001, we can see that Rhode Island became the second state to include transgender people in non-discrimination law, and 17 states now do so as well at this moment. And then looking at 2005, California became the first state to mandate transgender healthcare coverage with the Insurance Gender Non-Discrimination Act. Fast forward to April 2009, a jury in Colorado found Alan Andrade guilty of killing Angie Zapata, and this case was one of the first cases in which a hate crime law was applied to a murder trial in which the victim was transgender. And then looking into 2007, we see that the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission ruled that Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which prohibited discrimination based on sex, also included transgender people. Then looking into December of 2014, the Department of Justice ruled that Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited discrimination based on sex, also prohibited discrimination for gender identity in general. So looking at the history of activism and laws in the realm of gender identity presentation, we can see that a lot of activism has preceded a lot of the strong legislation that we have seen. And although that there's been a lot of strong legislation and policy that's been implemented in the last few decades, we can see that there's still a long way for us to go, especially in the terms of state laws.